Hey, good morning or good evening or good afternoon from wherever or whenever you're watching from. My name's Nathan Provost. It's great to be able to come into this course and be able to give a small lecture here about the Overland Campaign. Just a very brief synopsis of myself. So I actually have published a couple of articles related to the Overland Campaign. I am a doctoral candidate under Dr. Stephen Woodworth, and I'm currently in the process of writing my dissertation on the Battle of Cold Harbor, which is one of the 5 major battles of the Overland Campaign. And just to start off, this image is a pretty popular, or I suppose powerful image of Ulysses Grant watching over his army crossing the James River towards the end of his campaign. That really will be a major turning point, not just in the campaign itself, but the war overall. It was British military theorist JFC Fuller that said if there was ever a gap in generalship between Grant and Lee, it was over logistics. So let's just first begin talking a little bit about the overall Union strategy. Just to be clear before we get started, this information that I am pulling from primarily comes from Gordon Ray. It comes from Alfred Young III. It comes from a variety of scholars, including Stephen Woodworth. And I will always put the source at the bottom of the map. So you will see this one comes from Daniel Sauerwein. So before the Overland Campaign even begins, Grant is brought out east after his victory at the Battle of Chattanooga in Tennessee. It was a major Union victory. Grant is promoted to general-in-chief. He is in charge of not just one army, but all of the armies. And now it's up to him to design and coordinate a grand strategy that will cripple the Confederacy. So as we are talking about the Overland Campaign, it will be important to understand that other offensives are taking place, not just in Virginia, but in places like Georgia and Louisiana, out in the Shenandoah. All of these places will encompass major offensives. I have listed those offensives here. The Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel will be defeated by a smaller force of Confederates there in the Shenandoah Valley. It will not be until September that the Union will dominate the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. The James River Peninsula, I actually put as somewhat inconclusive here. Benjamin Butler was a politician, and he became a general in the Union Army. This was something that was common during the Civil War. He is going to lead a force up the James River Peninsula. Grant hoped eventually he would be able to either take Richmond or cut the railroad between the cities of Petersburg and Richmond. He knew the James River Peninsula would play a very important role. And even though Butler was unable to take Richmond, he was quote unquote bottled up by Confederate forces. It played a significant part in Grant's crossing the James River. Southwest Virginia is not very well known. It was led by General Crook. He successfully cut the Tennessee and Virginia Railroad out in Virginia, and it was one of the very few that actually succeeded in this time period. The Red River Campaign will be an absolute disaster. It will be led by Nathaniel Banks out west. The Atlanta Campaign will actually be led by one of Grant's former subordinates out in the Western theater of the war, William T. Sherman. He will lead the Army of Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, to Atlanta, and they will not take Atlanta until September. But we're not here to talk about any of those. We're specifically here to talk more about the Overland Campaign. And of course, this is going to be in the far eastern part of Virginia for the last basically 3 years. It's been a stalemate on the Eastern Front. Is Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army successfully defeated a multitude of Union generals until Lee was really defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg under George Meade. However, Meade was unable to trap or destroy Lee's army. So Grant is ultimately brought east, and Grant is the one that decides he is going to go with the Army of the Potomac because he knows they face the toughest challenge, which is defeating the indomitable Robert E. Lee. It's going to consist of 5 major battles, as I mentioned. Some of these are going to last sometimes 2 weeks long. I'm specifically talking about Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor. The major objectives are actually going to be a bit different for really each side. Robert E. Lee wants to push the Union Army back across the Rapidan River. Now, of course, this is going to be unfeasible. Whoops, did not mean to go forward there. He wants to push them back across the Rapidan. Now, as Grant continuously turns Lee's flank, he knows this is not feasible. So at this point in time, he just wants to make sure he is not pinned in a city because he knows he will be unable to supply his army. Grant actually does not want to pin him in a city either. He would rather destroy his army in the field because he knows that a siege would take too long. It would be too prolonged, but nonetheless, it would at least negate Lee's offensive capabilities, which is what Grant ultimately wanted to do. The main objective was, well, I want to capture or destroy Lee's army. If he can't do that, because this is 19th century warfare, it's extremely difficult to do that, although Grant has already done it twice, once at Fort Donelson and the other at Vicksburg. So he thinks it is very possible for him to do so again. Now, Grant will ultimately decide to pass through an area known as the Wilderness. He is going to pass through with a force of 124,000 men. The Confederates will try to prevent this crossing, although Grant will successfully hold the Orange Plank Road, the Brock Road, to move his army through, despite the very heavy forest that is there. And it is much denser in that time than it is now. And you can actually see behind me the Wilderness area, and behind me would have been something like Grant's headquarters. Now, the casualties, it was extremely bloody fighting here. Basically, there were 2 parts of this battle. One was more on a northern front. General Winfield, Scott Hancock would be farther south. It would be back and forth fighting over the course of basically 2 days for the most part. But often what is really focused is the casualties from both sides, and there's a bit of an issue when talking about the casualties. Unfortunately, historians in the past have tended to measure victory based upon the casualties. But this campaign is much more nuanced and complex than that. So yes, the Union casualties will be much higher than the Confederate casualties. However, you can see here on a ratio basis, the Union will actually lose 15% of their army. The Confederates will lose 17% of their army. So the Union Army was able to hold these roads. And most significantly, Grant on May 7th, instead of continuously sending men off to attack Confederate fortifications in the wilderness, he decides to opt for a turning movement. And JFC Fuller actually calls this movement the greatest strategic victory in the Army of the Potomac. Now, they will actually end up at a place called Spotsylvania Courthouse somewhere on May 8th, May 9th. And this battle is going to last 2 weeks, basically. And here, this is where most notably is the mule shoe, which you can actually see on my screen. Outjuds this salient, or what is known as a mule shoe. On May 12th, Grant is going to launch a major attack against this position. The Union Army will suffer something like 11,000 casualties. The Confederates will lose something like 9,000. It's some of the bloodiest fighting in 24 hours. There's hand-to-hand combat that takes place. It is a very bloody affair. And ultimately, this will be some of the bloodiest fighting of the campaign, with the Union losing over 18,000 soldiers, or 17% of their army, while the Confederates lose something like 13,421, or 21% of their forces. So even though Grant takes this entire area, Lee is going to be able to plug that gap and set up a stronger defensive line. Really, the significance of this battle is something like attritional warfare. It is a bit of a myth that Grant fights a war of attrition, but ultimately he will succeed in breaking Confederate morale. He's going to capture thousands of soldiers. And this is when we start to see a lot of Confederate desertions in the Army. The Union Army will continue to hold the initiative. Now, this is when, of course, Sigel is defeated in the Shenandoah Valley. Grant realizes he will not be receiving reinforcements from behind Lee's army. So he is going to decide on another turning movement. Now, they will end up at a place called North Anna. And oftentimes, historians in the past have said Lee was outnumbered 2-1. That is definitely not the case here. In fact, this is the closest amount of forces we'll see face each other. Both sides are going to lose about the same amount of casualties for the most part. The Union lose about 1,000 more. Really, this is a bit of a lull in the fighting. There's some back and forth, but the most significant thing about this battle is that Robert E. Lee is going to establish what is known as an inverted V. So you can actually see here on the map, this point, it was called Ox Ford. Lee is basically going to split up Grant's army in 2 different sections. So if someone from right needed to go reinforce Hancock's forces, they would have to cross the North Anna twice, which was a big problem. There is speculation and arguments that Lee wanted to attack Hancock's forces here, but he is too sick. And that is true. He was very ill at this point in time. He was suffering from dysentery, but he was unable to find a capable officer to attack, because by this point in the campaign, Lee had lost a lot of Confederate officers. Do I think it's feasible that Lee could have attacked here? Sure. Do I think it would have succeeded? No. Hancock held 2 different bridges that he would have been able to fall back on, and his defensive line by this point in time was too strong. So Grant, he realizes the strength of their position here, and once again, he decides to turn Lee's flank again, which will lead to one of the most misunderstood battles of the campaign, which is Cold Harbor. And this is actually what I am writing my current dissertation on. So this battle is going to last basically from May 27th to June 12th. I do include the battle of, or the engagements around Totopotomoy Creek into this account. By this point in the campaign, Grant was reinforced by the Army of the James. So because Benjamin Butler was bottled up on the James River Peninsula. The Confederates will also be reinforced, and the Union Army will have 108,000 soldiers. The Confederates will have about 62, something almost similar to Spotsylvania Courthouse. The casualties will not be as bloody. However, the most notable part of this battle was June 3rd, where I should back up and say on June 1st, the Union Army successfully pushed back the Confederates, and they were only 15 miles outside of Richmond at this point. The Confederates, their morale at this point had really, despite what some have said, some Confederate morale was high, others was low. There were still desertions. People inside Richmond were getting a bit concerned or worried because the Union Army was only 15 miles outside of it. And keep in mind, this had not happened since 1862. So this was greatly concerning that Grant was already near Richmond in under a month. So here, the Confederate forces are backed again. Their backs are against the wall. And after June 1st, they begin building entrenchments and breastworks as quickly as they can. Grant originally was supposed to launch an attack on June 2nd, but the Second Corps of the Union Army was much too tired, along with the 18th Corps, as well as the 6th Corps, that they just decided, you know what, we're exhausted. We've done months of campaigning, fighting almost every single day. Let's take a break. Let's take a breather. Well, unfortunately, that breather is going to cost them a very important victory. On June 3rd, an uncoordinated attack takes place against the Confederate left and right. The Union Army on the left is going to briefly break through, but then is pushed out. And then on the right, actually the Union had quite a bit of success. They began turning the Confederate left, and the cavalry under James Wilson was actually able to threaten the rear of Confederate General Jubal Early's Second Corps. So he had to fall back off the Shady Grove Road. Now, with that said, Grant had to suspend assaults at this point in time because by this point in the battle, or that day, the Union Army had already lost 6,000 soldiers between 4:30 a.m. and about noon. The Confederates at this point had suffered about 1,500 casualties. So that's where the majority of the casualties will come from. But what isn't often talked about is what happens between June 4th to June 12th. The Confederates had an opportunity, and Lee even wrote to Jefferson Davis, hoping to catch the Union outside of their entrenchments. But even Jubal Early, a Confederate general, said that the Union Army was defended on all sides and it was just about impossible. Nonetheless, Lee is going to order 3 limited offensives against the Union line. All 3 will fail. They'll suffer a couple thousand casualties, and that is ultimately what brings their casualty count up to 8,344. They'll lose roughly about the same ratio of soldiers in this battle. A lot of times what's been said is, the Union Army was obliterated. It was this horrible defeat, but really it wasn't. The Union Army actually didn't retreat after that failed assault on June 3rd. They actually dug in where they were at under orders of Ulysses S. Grant. And I could go on and talk a lot about how Grant used innovative ideas and thought he could besiege this army on an open plain, which was the first time in history this had ever happened. But nonetheless, Grant decides to develop an operation that would be equal to or greater than that of his Vicksburg campaign. and that was the crossing of the James River, which we saw that image at the very beginning of this presentation. So the Union Army miraculously is going to cross the James River and try to target Petersburg, which is the logistical hub of the Army of Northern Virginia, or Lee's army. And Lee will be stunned by the fact he will wake up June 12th and not have any idea as to where the Union Army went. And he actually really won't know until, for the most part, June 16th. So there will be basically 4 days where he will not be sure where the Union Army is at. And unfortunately, the Union Army misses out on an opportunity of a lifetime, which is that on June 15th, when the Union Army showed up at Petersburg, there was barely any Confederate forces defending it. Unfortunately, the Union commander did not press forward, thinking the Confederate line was more heavily defended than it was, but it's all 20/20 hindsight, and the fog of war blinds the commander so much. Unfortunately, the Union Army will lose a massive amount of casualties trying to attack the breastworks of Petersburg. They will successfully take quite a few lines, major lines of defenses, but they will be unable to take the city itself. And finally, on June 18th, that's when Grant says, dig in. We're going to use some siege-like tactics, even though they hadn't fully enveloped the city, which is why I do not call it a orthodox siege. It's a quasi-siege, an unorthodox siege. And this will go on for a period of 9 months. So where does this really leave us? Why is this campaign so significant? Well, it depends on how you look at it. In the past, historians have often said, well, the Union Army lost more soldiers. It threatened the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. Therefore, either it's a inconclusive or a Confederate victory, what have you. I disagree with this interpretation. And the reason being is because really they're going to lose about the same ratio of forces during this campaign. And ultimately, Grant knows to target the logistics of the Confederacy. It's not just simply because the Union has more soldiers or more supplies. Keep in mind, the more supplies you have, the more you have to guard. The more you have to worry about getting those items to the army and then distributing them. Grant is actually going to have his own manpower issues in August of 1864. So really, at the end of the day, what really determines this victory is the military situation that Robert E. Lee is facing. At one point, he told a Confederate officer, if it becomes a siege, it is only a matter of time. And he realizes that. The amazing thing about Lee is that he could pull a rabbit out of its hat. But that is only if he is able to maneuver. Grant made sure that if he left Petersburg, he was doomed, because the Union Army would be able to not just take Petersburg, but Richmond as well, which is the capital of the Confederacy, which would be a major defeat for Lee. So Lee knows he cannot abandon Petersburg or Richmond. So at this point in time, all the other Union armies now are able to advance on all fronts without worrying about the forces of Robert E. Lee. Now, of course, there's the argument, the amount of casualties hurt the re-election of Lincoln. Ultimately, it doesn't. Grant is able to respond to it effectively by issuing orders not to launch assaults against fortified positions, limiting the number of casualties. And he is able to win significant victories in Atlanta, in the Shenandoah, and Mobile. Even though Grant wasn't there, keep in mind, this was all of his grand strategy. This was all of his thinking. Okay. And also, Lee is going to suffer from attrition. He's going to lose many capable officers, and he is unable to replace them with more capable ones. So yeah, to that effect, it is attrition. But ultimately, this is still debated and it's up to you. And I really do want to thank you again for listening to this. And if you have any other questions, always feel free to reach out to me at nlprovost20@gmail.com. I'm more than happy to answer any other questions for you. Thank you.